Good morning, everyone. It's fantastic to be here. I just love being here, being in Glasgow, and I've really enjoyed meeting all the people associated with SCCR. We had a great dinner last night, so thank you for asking me. It's really lovely to be working with you all. It's really difficult to come at this time of the morning because, of course, what I really want to do is throw away what I prepared and talk about all the things that you've raised, things that Drew talked about, things that George talked about, and so on. Obviously, I'm not going to do that, but I do just want to make a couple of comments about the things that Drew said in relation to this report that you've done, which I think is incredibly interesting and important. And Drew mentioned 7 and 9. So 7 is 50% of young people and 81% of parents would like more support to address the issues of conflict at home. That is a huge number. That's pretty well 4 out of 5 parents who want something. But the important thing is that people don't know about services to support them. And that's a real issue with parents of teenagers. And I think the fact is they don't know about services because actually there aren't very many services. That's the real problem. And at the end of my talk, I will say something about some of the things I think we can do. There remains an ongoing, number 9, there remains an ongoing culture across Scotland of what happens at home, stays at home. Now, that's not just Scotland. Let me reassure you. I think that one of the things that's very powerful about parenting teenagers is that you don't want to talk about it. There is a sense of shame. There is a sense of isolation. In fact, Penny on the film said, it's very different when you don't take them to school anymore and so on. But there really is a sense, I think, among parents that you can't talk about it. And I do a lot of running workshops for parents of teenagers, and I am continually struck by how people come into these workshops and they genuinely think that what's happening to them in their home is something that is just about them. People say, I feel I'm a crap parent. And the experience of listening to other parents, discovering that you're not the only one, that actually the things that you are experiencing, other people are experiencing too, is a revelation. So it really is important, I think, that we need to address this whole issue of isolation. And the last thing I just mentioned on page, this is part 3, what young people and parents and carers want. And top 3 young people's choices, the top one is communication. Now, isn't that interesting? Because most of us think that teenagers don't want to communicate with us. I'm going to come back to that. Okay, let me start. Now, I'm going to start just by telling you a little anecdote. I have been really enjoying myself running a program which is about the teenage brain. And I'm going to talk more about it in the workshop that Abby and I are doing later. But I just want to tell you that these workshops, which we run, are attended by teachers, social workers, youth workers, and so on. And they come in, and we have a sort of cafeteria style, a bit like this. And so that's what we do. And the first exercise is we want to ask you, so you're sitting in your tables, write on a Post-it note, so we give them Post-it notes, 4 typical teenage behaviors. They sit there, so they've got, say, 4 or 5 people, and they've got to write down on these Post-it notes these 4 typical teenage behaviors, and then we ask them to come up, and we stick all the Post-it notes on the flip chart, right? So this is taken from a real event that happened about 2 weeks ago. So I haven't made these up at all. So this is the first table. Mood swings, risk-taking, apathy, no sense of self, not sure what they're doing. Here's the second table. Emotional roller coaster, argumentative, sleeping a lot, pushing boundaries. Here's the third table. Sulking, withdrawal, lack of communication, not getting up in the morning, stroppiness. And here's the last one, I won't go on. Self-centered, secretive, not taking advice, they know it all. Resistant, but overreactive. So you don't say anything. You put all these post-it notes up here, and you just let people react. And this is honestly what happened. Woman in the front row, she put her head in her hands like that, and she said, I feel terrible. I feel so ashamed. And someone else said, it's embarrassing, isn't it? Someone else said, God, I feel guilty. And you could feel this emotion in the room. And everyone was amazed that actually they had said such negative things, not a single positive thing. And someone said, this is ridiculous. I mean, teenagers aren't all negative. And yet, there you are. You know, this is a group of professional people. They've been asked typical teenage behaviors and what they put up. And that's really important. And I think that I start with that because I think, you know, this is critical in terms of this stage and the conflict that's going on. So what is going on? So first of all, is teenage behavior actually all these things? Are they sulky, moody, difficult, stroppy, won't get up in the morning, and so on? Is that the correct, you know, is that reality? Okay? Is it that society actually has a down on teenagers, that teenagers are seen in a negative light? And we all know, you can go back to Shakespeare, you know, The Winter's Tale, the famous quote. You can go back to Plato and the Greeks. People have described teenagers as difficult. So do we have a problem in society? Is it that parents and families, carers as well, find teenage behavior very difficult because of the challenge, because of the sense of loss? We were just talking about when your child grows up and becomes much more mature, you feel you've lost that informal relationship with your child. Or is there a fundamental lack of understanding about teenage development? So if we had time, which we don't, I would get you to talk about this on your tables. But I think what is going on is really, really important, because this negative perception, we all know about how conflict develops. This negative perception is an absolutely key factor. So here's some possible explanations. So first of all, these behaviors, which we all know and we're all familiar with, and most of you, many of you, will either have teenagers at home or you have had teenagers or whatever it is. I've got teenage grandchildren, which is very, very interesting, looking at it from a different perspective. Reflect something about both the brain and social development. So we know, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the brain, but one of the things we've learnt in the last sort of 15 years is that the brain continues to develop and change in adolescence. It's really interesting. If you look back, the year 2000, which is only 16 years ago, we really didn't know that there was any change during this period. So everyone thought that the brain stopped developing at the end of childhood. We have learnt a huge amount about how much change there is. And a lot of those behaviors that those people described, the emotional roller coaster, the hormones, sleeping, all to do with melatonin and the brain, a lot of the difficulties, the intense concentration on yourself, the self-awareness, self-consciousness, and so on, all those things can be described in relation to the brain. But there's also the social development, the peer pressure, and so on. So maybe those behaviors are really reflecting the stage of development, and maybe it's not so surprising. Maybe there's a real struggle within families about power, and I think power is really important, because really when the children are younger, the parents hold the power, the adults hold the power. But what is happening during these teenage years is that gradually power is being given up. And some people find that really difficult, not surprisingly. So do you see the family as like a political system with a struggle over power? It's a really interesting concept. And I think sometimes, certainly in my work with parents, just that concept of a struggle over power can help parents stand back and think about, well, what is happening here? Is it really that adults in our society simply have no preparation or help or education to understand adolescent development? It's a hugely important stage in our human journey. And yet, do we do we do anything about helping people understand it? No, we don't. I spent many years in Oxford, at Oxford University, and one of the things I was doing was training teachers, people who were going to be teachers. And I had a real struggle to persuade the department that actually we should be including something about teenage development, because they didn't do that. And if you talk to social workers in training, how much do they get? Doctors in training, do they ever get anything about adolescence? No, they don't. So are we really at fault here? Because here's a stage which actually a lot of the behavior can be explained, we can understand it, and yet we do not prepare adults for this stage of development. And then the last thing is, what's the role of the media? Does society really play up to and encourage this concept of difficulty? And there are people who have different views about that, but clearly the way in which society portrays this age group is playing a part, and the media reflect that. Now, it's obviously very important to distinguish different types of conflict, and I know many of you are mediators or work in this area, so I'm probably saying things that you're very familiar with. But I do think it's important. We can't just talk about conflict in a generic sense, because different families have different issues, different ways, or different concerns that they have around conflict. And I think we need to be a bit more nuanced, because clearly the interventions, what we're going to do, how we're going to help families, is going to depend on the nature of the conflict. We cannot, put in the same basket families who are struggling over, I don't know, untidy bedrooms or time to come home at night or whatever it is, with families where perhaps there's been a divorce or family breakdown, relationship breakdown, and where the teenager is really, really angry, maybe physically angry, expressing their anger in a physical sense, or, as we've heard, teenagers who leave home because they feel that the situation at home is so intolerable and conflict can't be resolved. So we have to be, I think, careful about this. So, at the one end, I think of it as a continuum. At the one end, you've got what you might call standard or normative conflict, and pretty well all families, as everyone in this room will know, experience this sort of thing. People need help to deal with it, but it is something that is true of most people. But on the other hand, of course, there's the really deep-seated conflict where, if you like, an additional layer or level of help is needed, where the young person may, or the family may get to a point where the young person, can't live at home anymore, or where the young person feels abused or neglected or rejected and runs away. So, we've got a really big range here, and I think it's very important when we're thinking about what we can do, which I'll come to at the end. It's really important to keep those distinctions in mind. So I've already mentioned this. It's, obviously, I've had some pretty searing experiences with, as a result of family breakdown, where parents have talked to me about their teenager attacking them physically, where the degree of anger, the sense of loss, the feeling of betrayal is really palpable, and where the teenager will say that this happened to them, they were never consulted, it was something that was imposed, they were never talked to them about it, and they've lost a parent. And maybe they've had to move home, so they maybe have to move school, they've lost their friends, and all this has been done to them. And they feel some people feel very, very, very angry about that. And that can, if it isn't acknowledged and worked through, can lead to physical violence and aggression. These things can really, really have a very serious impact. Abusive or neglectful parenting, of course. George referred to some of these factors in terms of the early years. neighbourhood and community factors. You know, we're very conscious of the sorts of pressures that might be on young people if they live in gang-affected areas, for example, the lack of resources, the pressure from the peer group. Those things can really make a difference. Sibling rivalry, you've probably, many of you will have worked with families where that sort of issue becomes really, really difficult to manage. One sibling may be bullying the other. There may be physical violence between the two, or an older sibling may be, as it were, leading a younger sibling into behaviour that you, as a parent, feel is unacceptable. And over-restrictive parenting, because often, you know, if parents, and going back to the power issue, if parents can't allow some increasing autonomy, then sooner or later, the young person, most young people, will find the need to express their own individuality and developing identity, and that can lead to serious conflict as well. Okay, I don't want to be too academic, but I did want to just say a little bit about these 4 theories, which I thought might be helpful in thinking about adolescence and adolescent development. So, as I said, as far as the brain is concerned, we know, first of all, that this is a time probably of the biggest change in the brain, apart from the first 2 or 3 years. So that's the first thing. And part of that is what I think is usefully called rewiring. So what happens is that at the end of childhood, there's a huge increase. George was talking about the synapses. There's a huge increase in the number of neurons in the grey matter, and that leads to a huge increase in the connections, and not all those connections are helpful. So what happens during the teenage years is that the brain gradually rewires itself. You've probably heard the phrase use it or lose it, and that's really about the fact that some of the connections need to be embedded, the useful connections, the things that are to do with learning, and the ones that aren't so useful die away. And the brain is rewiring itself, reconnecting itself. It's hugely complex, as George indicated. But that's really important because, as I said, so many of the behaviors can be explained through understanding what's going on in the brain. So very often, you know, we see teenage behavior as just difficult, stroppy, difficult, or whatever it is. And actually, it's not. It's part of this process. And sleep is a really good example. It is a really good example. Most people you talk to talk about, you know, teenagers not getting up in the morning, being very sleepy, and so on. And mostly people think they're just being difficult. But now we know that there is a biological reason why teenagers find it difficult to get to sleep at night. And that's because the hormone that makes us sleepy, melatonin, actually doesn't behave in quite the same way in teenagers as it does in you and I. So for you and me, when we get to, I don't know, 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night, the melatonin levels rise in your brain, that makes you feel sleepy, and that tells you it's time to go to bed. But what we've learned is that those melatonin levels rise significantly later in teenagers. And that's really important because it means it's more difficult to get to sleep. It means that they may be getting too little sleep because teenagers need a lot of sleep. And it leads to all sorts of behaviors, just as the ones I've been describing. Now, actually, there's a lot you can do to overcome the melatonin deficit, as it's called, and getting into good sleep routines, learning about sleep, helping the young person through this. It's perfectly possible to develop good sleep routines so that you overcome this melatonin deficit. But if you don't, then young people who suffer from a real deficit, not getting enough sleep, that affects learning, and it affects behavior. So that's an example of what we've learned from the knowledge about brain development. And I could talk a lot about this. I'll talk more about it in the workshop. Social domain theory. Now, this is really interesting. It sounds technical, but it isn't really. And what it means is that the different domains in the family, in your everyday life, actually are not perceived in quite the same way by the parent and by the teenager. So let me give you an example. So we'll think about the domain of the bedroom. Right, now the teenager says, this is my space. This is my area, and if I'm messy, if I don't clear up, if I still have dirty plates and cups in my room, that's my room. It's my space, okay? And the mother says, or the parent says, that room is in my house. That's my house, and therefore that's my domain. And what you do in that room affects me. And so that is something I should have a say in, okay? So social domain theory looks at these different domains and explores how teenagers and parents see these things. What role does a parent have in education, health, friendship, sex, and so on? Now, if you ask teenagers and parents about these things, they agree on some things. So most parents and teenagers will agree that parents have a right to know and be involved in education. But parents and teenagers may very well disagree about things to do with, for example, health or friends. And very often the conflicts are about these domains, that the two parents and teenagers actually see their roles differently. So parents think they've got a right to be involved in whatever it is, one domain, but the teenager doesn't see it like that. The teenager sees the parent as having rights in some areas, but not in others. And so social domain theory is really exploring how these conflicts arise because of different perceptions of what is acceptable in terms of the parent's behavior. And this has been extended in a very interesting way in theories which are called the right to know. What does my parent have the right to know? And this is also very, very interesting and particularly relevant to health, which is one of the things I'm particularly concerned about. So parents and teenagers do agree about some things, but they often disagree about others. Obviously, it varies from family to family. But exploring those ideas can be incredibly helpful. So if you talk to a teenager about what that teenager thinks the parent has a right to know, and then you talk to the parent about it, and then you can actually put that on the table and explore it with them, that can be incredibly helpful, because very often people do disagree, and things like sex are particularly contentious issues. But there are boundaries and limits which differ in each family, so exploring those really can make a difference. Certainly in the work, I do work with GPs and pediatricians and others who work with teenagers, and just actually talking this through with professional, professional medical personnel in terms of how you manage consultations which have a parent and a teenager and so on. The right to know, the issue of the right to know is really, really interesting. Communication theory. Now, I wouldn't want to push this, but I would probably like to argue that an awful lot of conflict, not the really extreme conflict, but an awful lot of what we might call the normative conflict, is down to communication problems. And I've written a book which is called Why Won't My Teenager Talk to Me? And I think this is really, really important. And I'm fascinated that in your report, it's actually the teenagers who say that they want advice about communication. Because actually, it's the adults who say, my teenager won't talk to me. In fact, the very first workshop that I ran in Oxford with a group of parents, the very first question that someone put their hand up and asked was exactly that. Why won't my teenager? That's why they came to the workshop, because they didn't understand why their teenager wouldn't talk to them. And so we know that teenagers, and your report exactly reflects that, we know that teenagers do want to talk. They do want to talk to their parents. Of course they do. But they want to talk in a way that feels okay to them. They want to talk in a way that respects their privacy. They want to talk in a way that they feel they're going to be respected and listened to. And very often, and I'm sorry to say this, but very often we as adults are very poor at that. I often talk about one-way and two-way communication. One-way communication is me asking you something or telling you something. And that's what teenagers experience. They experience adults as either telling them or interrogating them. Two-way communication is when you're actually showing that you want to do as much listening as talking. Two-way communication goes both ways. And that is what teenagers want. They want to be listened to. They want to be heard, not surprisingly. And if you can show, as an adult, as a parent, that you really want to be listening, you will find that communication is an awful lot easier. Now, there's a lot I can say about communication, but even in the film that we saw with Penny and Iona, actually, I suspect that what the mediator did was help them communicate with each other. They weren't listening to it. In fact, Iona said, I'm not listening. And the mother said, I'm not listening. They weren't listening. They weren't hearing each other. They weren't able to hear each other. They basically they were stuck in a sort of a cycle of perceiving each other as angry or resentful or not listening, not paying attention to my needs. Very often parents say, my teenager doesn't recognize my needs. Well, do you recognize the teenager's needs? You know, that it's recognizing each other's needs. Okay. And lastly, I just want to talk about perceived control, because I think perceived control is really, really interesting. Now, this is something George may know about. This comes from work in America on abusive families. And what the work originally looked at was the sense that the parent had of whether they were in control of their child or not. And what the argument was that low perceived control, in other words, if you felt you had no control, particularly over a 3-year-old who was throwing temper tantrums and so on, that led, in some cases, to a much more physically punishing or abusive relationship. But it's been extended, this idea, to parents of teenagers. And I think it's really, really important, because what happens, as you all know, is that the parent's confidence gradually goes up during the primary school years, and then what happens when puberty comes along? Confidence drops right off, okay? And what happens often is that the parent feels that things are out of their control. They feel that they've lost control. And we all know that when we feel that sense of having lost control, we feel anxious, right? We feel anxious. And that anxiety leads to responses and behavior that might not necessarily be the most productive or functional, but that's what happens when we're anxious. And very many parents describe feeling anxious because they're losing control. They can't keep their teenager safe. They don't know what their teenager is doing. So you've got the anxiety, but after the anxiety comes two possible things. Either you really get depressed, you feel low, you feel hopeless and helpless, and you give up, which is what some parents do. Or you become over-controlling and over-restrictive, because that's a way of managing your anxiety. And I think this idea of perceived control, for me, has been really, really helpful. I've talked about it with parents. I've got them to think about, I've got them to put on a line, you know, feeling totally in control, feeling not in control at all, putting across on that line, and then at the end of the workshop, we think about it again and so on. It's really helpful, because people don't think like that. They don't think about, they feel their anxiety, of course, but they don't think about what's happened here. I'm losing control. They could articulate it, but it doesn't flow through to understanding really the behavior. Okay. Very, very briefly, I feel strongly, as you can guess, that it is so important for us to have some sort of framework to help parents understand this stage. And I've developed a framework, which I'm not going to talk about very much now because I don't have the time, but I've called it the stage framework. And the reason I wanted something which was relatively easy to grasp, easy for parents to understand, but that reflected not everything, but the key things about adolescent development and about parenting. So it's in the book that I described, Why Won't My Teenager Talk to Me? It's in there, and I've written about it in other places. It's called The Stage because this is a stage. It's really important to understand that it's a stage. parents feel it's the end of the world, that their lovely child will never come back again, and so on. It's a process. It's a stage. Helping parents understand that, incredibly important. But I called it the stage framework because these letters represent things that I think are absolutely incredibly important. Significance. Oops, this is falling to pieces here. Significance. Parents of teenagers are significant. They are very important. Parents of teenagers think they're not important anymore because their teenager doesn't want to talk to them, they want to talk to their friends or whatever it is. We know that parents of teenagers are just as important as parents of younger children, they're just important in a different way. And there's masses of research that shows, whether you look at health, whether you look at school achievement, whether you look at self-esteem, all those things show that the involvement, engagement, and support that parents give makes a huge difference. So that's the first message. Parents of teenagers matter. I've talked about two-way communication, so I won't talk about that again. Authority. How do we exercise authority in this stage? We know how to do it with children. Do we know how to do it with teenagers? And it is really important to shift. You are not going to be a controlling parent. You're going to be a negotiating parent who works with the young person, who uses their authority, but in an authoritative way, not an authoritarian way. I put the G in there because I think there is a difference between growing up today and growing up when you and I were teenagers. And it's very often the case that we don't recognize that. And, you know, today it is so incredibly different from our experiences. Sex. Just think about sex today. And what your teenager, my grandchildren, what they're experiencing, what sex means, how it's experienced, is incredibly different. We have to recognize that. Teenagers don't like to be judged. One of the things they often say is, I feel I'm being judged, I feel my parents judge me, and so on. They don't like to be judged. And judgment is often about us using the values, using our experiences of our teenage years. So really, you know, recognizing the generation gap. And then the last thing is emotion, the most important one perhaps. Teenagers' emotions, very difficult. Emotion regulation is a real issue for teenagers, just as I've been saying, because of the brain. But it's also an issue for parents. So parents feel angry, they feel resentful, they feel frustrated, they feel sad. There's a definite sense of loss. They feel ashamed. One of the things why parents don't talk to other people is because they feel ashamed. They feel embarrassed. They feel they ought to be getting it right. They feel they're a crap parent. And so the two, you know, if you've got two lots of emotions like that, it obviously makes a huge difference. I can't talk any more about it, I'm afraid, because I need to move on. Okay, lastly, where next? So first of all, we need to find routes to get to parents of teenagers. And this is a real challenge, because they don't congregate at the school gate. They feel anxious about getting advice. They don't like to feel they've got to get advice now. So how do we get to them? We really need to work with schools. I think schools have a huge part to play. And my experience has been that as austerity has bitten, many schools who have parent advisors or parent coordinators or whatever, those posts have been lost. And that's a real problem. And I think you know, it's a real challenge to think about how we can engage schools and how we can work with schools. SCCR, voluntary sector, has a huge role to play, and that's a struggle because of funding issues. But we mustn't forget that the voluntary sector is probably doing things that government isn't doing, local authorities aren't doing, the statutory sector isn't doing. Obviously, I don't need in this audience to talk about mediation. We've talked about it. I do think that it is something that most people do not associate with families with teenagers. They think about divorce and they think about family breakdown. They don't think about parents and teenagers. So I think we've probably got a lot to do in terms of educating society about how mediation can really work. We must learn better, and you know, I don't know if I can even say this without blushing, but social media. We need to learn how to use social media, because you know, we've got a generation of parents, of teenagers, who are beginning to have grown up with the internet and with the world that, for people like me, you know, I'm just about okay. You know, I understand Twitter, and I've been forced to go have a WhatsApp thing on my phone. But, you know, it is a hugely important area. And I think if we're thinking about how to get to parents of teenagers, often I think the conventional ways aren't really the right ones. So we need to think about that. But I think overall, I just feel that this group of parents needs more empowerment and more support, because my experience is that this group of parents feels unsupported, feels that there isn't the information out there, feels there's a term blindsided, you know, that my teenager has arrived and I really don't know what my role is. That's the most powerful thing I've experienced. So I think all the things that we've been talking about today really need to be disseminated, publicized. We need parents to be empowered. We need parents of teenagers to feel that they are an important group. So if I had one message for parents of teenagers, it would be, you are important. You are really, really important. Don't feel that you are a useless parent, a parent who doesn't cope, who doesn't understand. You are really important. So that's my message. Thank you very much.